afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this incredible conversation about how to encourage kids to read and how to build a reading culture and support the reading ecosystem between myself, the incredible Sally Rippin and Alan Dingley. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all attending from today. For Sally and I, that is the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'd invite you also to take a moment to pay your own respects to the elders of the lands that you're either streaming or watching this recording from. And after I've introduced Alan, he will also be giving an acknowledgement for the traditional owners of the lands in New Zealand that he is joining us from today. I'd like to introduce our two guests in just a minute. Before I do, I would like to thank the organisations that have worked together to put this event on, the Australian Children's Laureate Foundation, the ACLF, of course the Wheeler Centre where we're sitting right now, and Te Awhi Rito, New Zealand Reading Ambassador, for their work not only on this event but also for championing the work of young readers and of people writing and advocating for those readers. I'd also just like to remind everybody that as we go, I will throw out questions at the end, but of course send them through on our Slido as we have our conversation today, and I'll check those towards the end of the session. The QR code for the Slido can of course be found on the screen right now. Okay, I'd like to introduce our guests. First up, Sally Rippin is with me at the Wheeler Centre today. Sally is the Australian Children's Laureate for 2024 to 2025 and has written over 100 books for children and young adults, many of them award-winning, including Come Over to My House, the Billy B. Brown and Hey Jack series. She's also written a book for parents, Wild Things, How We Learn to Read and What Happens When We Don't. Her widely popular books are beloved across the globe and have sold more than 10 million copies in 18 countries. Currently, she's working on several books for children, as well as adapting her work for the screen. Sally loves to write stories with heart and characters that resonate with children, parents, and teachers alike. Thank you for joining us, Sally.
Thank you, Beck.
And then all the way from New Zealand, we have Alan Dingley, who was born in Christchurch and raised in Hawke's Bay. He is the current Te Awhi Rito New Zealand Reading Ambassador, with over 25 years of experience working with children and young people, almost 20 of those in school and public libraries, and he's currently the library manager at Freyberg High School in Palmerston North. He has a deep knowledge of New Zealand children's and young adult YA literature, and in 2020 was on the judging panel for the Children's and Young People's Book Awards, the NZCYA, and then convener of judges in 2021. Welcome, Alan, and I will quickly throw over to you for your own acknowledgement of country.
Kia ora. I'd like to acknowledge I'm in Wellington at National Library, and I'd like to acknowledge Te Awhi Taranaki, which is the local iwi of the Māori people here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Indigenous people and the stakeholders of the land. So thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you both for joining me. Okay, I thought we would start by just hearing a bit about your platforms as the Laureate. What are you both attempting to do over these 2 years? And also, what is the landscape that you're building your platform on or from? So, Sally, I'll start with you, and then Alan, over to you.
I think it's a wonderful opportunity to get to talk to adults, actually, and I wonder if you can relate to this too, Alan, but we spend a lot of our time as children's authors and people working with children with our readers, which is vital and important, But I think one of the things I really want to get across in the 2 years that I'm Laureate is the kids are actually perfect as they are. We don't need to change them. Children are absolutely who they are, and everything about them is what we want to support to just grow and thrive. So I feel like for this 2 years as the Laureate is a really fantastic platform and opportunity to be able to talk to adults for a change. So teachers, librarians and change makers, to ensure that we're creating a world around our children where they can all thrive and where they can all really reach their best potentials.
Yeah, beautiful. I've got a few things, as you can see already, that I'd like to pick up on from that. But Sally, before I do, Alan, can I get you to share a bit about your platform as the Laureate?
Yeah, tēnā tātou katoa. Like Sally, I have a 2-year period here. The Tapu Rito New Zealand Reading Ambassador has been going since 2001, and Ben Brown was the first Tapu Rito. And basically our role is to travel around and as Sally said, talk to everyone from families, communities, whānau, schools, libraries, to push that importance of reading, creating reading role models, and creating that idea that reading for pleasure is just as important as anything else you do in life, if not more important than anything else. And yes, I completely agree, Sally, if you can get those parents captive in some way, it's so important. The kids, as you said, are perfect. And I kind of work from the bottom up, and I kind of sneak in with the kids and tell them to set traps with their parents to take a picture book home and be seen reading it, enjoying, giggling, laughing, and then just leave the book sitting there as a trap to the parents. So coming at different angles, but exactly the same outcome is that reading for pleasure is just something that will take you places that nothing else can.
That's so interesting, because we talk so much about the importance of role modelling reading for children, but actually what you're doing there, of course, is role modelling reading for parents, which is already providing a solution to a later question that I have. One thing that I'd like to talk about to start off with are some of the challenges that we're faced when trying to get kids and parents to read. Do either of you, I mean, you've both said this line, kids are perfect as they are, and of course I agree. But it does seem that there's a point at which reading becomes perceived as boring, or where it becomes a challenge, maybe within the learning environments that they're in, or it stops being seen as something that is interesting and exciting to do. Alan, perhaps I'll throw to you first for this. In your experience in school libraries, where is that point? Like, is there a particular age? Is there a particular factor that you think contributes to kids going from perfection to becoming potentially a non-reader?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been lucky enough to work across quite a few of the age groups, mostly in intermediate and high schools. And there's that perfect storm in that intermediate age group for us here, that's around age 10, 11, 12, 13, when they're starting to discover their reading preferences, their reading loves, and they're fostering good reading habits normally. And then they hit that into that sort of, I don't want to say puberty age, but that high school age where there's more distractions, they may be busier in life, there's other things going on, that brain that changes, or the chemical, things that change in their brain. That's where we really need to be trying to keep them on that reading journey, when they've understood that they've had instructional reading to learn how to read, and now they're getting into this indulgent reading sort of landscape, and how we keep that going from that intermediate through to that sort of teenage age is a really tricky thing to do. So that's where I think, in a way, the battleground is once we've got them into indulgent reading, how do we keep them there?
Sally, does that echo your experiences in Australia?
I think it's such a lovely overlap between what Alan and I are working towards. I feel like there's two real problems. One of them is losing a reader, but I think the area that I'm really interested in engaging adults with is actually creating a reader, because I think often what will happen is that children don't enjoy reading because they find it hard. And so they will plateau at around grade 3, as was the case for my youngest son, who's dyslexic and has ADHD. And children can look like they're reading for a certain number of years, and they can memorize enough words, and if they've got a book that has pictures in it. They can look like they're guessing what's going on. And a lot of the way that we used to teach reading involved guesswork, or it involved children looking at the context to explain what it was that they were coming up with. Well, you can't do that when you transition across to chapter books. So this is where we really see the very first time, I think, that children start to fall off, and that is around grade 3, where children are now expected to no longer, as Alan said, learn to read, but now read to learn. And I think that's the very first point where we recognise that if we don't catch them there isn't going to be any possibility to even create a joy of reading, because there's nothing more excruciating for a child who struggles to read than being asked to read aloud, or even to sit in a corner on their own and read for pleasure. There's no pleasure in doing something that you can't do or is difficult for you. So I feel like the really great overlap between what Alan and I are really advocating for is get them reading, ensure that we catch kids that might fall through the gaps early on, and then how do we keep them reading when they hit that other plateau. So yeah, I'm a real advocate for getting on really early as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to me, I mean, knowing you, Sally, and reading about your work, Alan, to note how you've both had really direct interactions with kids with learning difficulties. And I certainly think we're kind of seeing the tide of discussion around how to support kids who are struggling to read now. But what are some of the kind of stereotyped ideas or resistance that you've encountered when you've in the past tried to encourage people to adapt their practices to meet the needs of these particular children? Sally, I'll start with you.
I think the number one thing, and this is the thing a lot of parents of children who struggle to learn to read will hear, is that if you just read to your children enough, they'll pick it up by osmosis. This is actually not true, and this can put a terrible burden on parents to feel like they've done something wrong, or it can also put a terrible burden on the child that they feel like something is wrong with them. So unlike oral language, reading is actually something that needs to be explicitly taught, and so we're within the womb, we're hearing our parents talk, and so we're born already understanding their language. But reading and writing is a relatively new phenomenon for our brains, and so we actually had to rewire a part of our brain to become a proficient reader. And we know this because we can look in our brains now thanks to neuroscience, and there are people who are at the forefront of this kind of research who see that a part of our brain is not only rewired but adapted to specifically for this. And if it doesn't happen, we will never become proficient readers. And so I think that's the number one thing that really needs to come out loud and strong, is that reading is a skill that needs to be explicitly taught like any other skill, and it's not something that we just pick up by osmosis. And so if your child hasn't learned to read, it's not because you're a bad parent. So it's a really important message to get across.
Such an important message. Is there a point at which it's too late for that wiring to happen?
It's never too late, but unfortunately at the pace in which our school has to be run, that by the time your child is in about grade 3, from then on you're only ever catching up. So my son could read a little bit, but not really proficiently, and so this meant that every subject was affected because everything requires reading. And if you can't engage with school, that doesn't just affect your ability to learn, but it affects your self-esteem, it affects your mental health, and it affects your capacity to feel like you belong. And so kids very quickly start to feel like school and reading are not for them. And so they will engage with other kids who also identify this way, and this is where the problems really start. And so by the time they get to high school, they've already seen themselves as labelled either bad or distractible or naughty or just unintelligent or stupid, for want of a better word. And so these kids are now starting to believe these labels that are being stuck to them, and that really affects their self-worth and self-esteem. So there are so many things that can go wrong if children don't learn to read, and there are so many things that can go right if they do, and we'll be talking more about this today, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's so much shame, isn't there, for kids thinking that, you know, they've failed, or that it's about their intellect or their capacity to learn and understand. And for adults feeling much the same way, especially parents who, you know, are so, in my experience, afraid of getting it wrong, like so desperate to do the right thing.
Absolutely. And just to jump in on that, if I was to joke with you that I wasn't good at maths, you wouldn't judge my intelligence. But if somebody says to you, I'm not good at reading, straight away we make assumptions about their intelligence. So it's almost the number one thing we need to get right in our children.
Which is, sorry, Alan, I do want to throw to you, but it's so funny, isn't it, that, I mean, not funny, haha, but it's so funny that that is so true in terms of how we judge people socially and culturally, and yet we continue to defund and undermine programs that support reading. So it's like, you know, it does form the basis of who we are in society, and yet somehow we can't make that connection to where the funding goes and where the support goes. Alan, you've worked in libraries for a very long time, including with kids, specifically with learning difficulties. Do you want to talk about some of the changes you've seen in teaching practices and library engagement during that time to support kids?
Yeah, it's and everything, like I could sit and listen to Sally for ages. Absolutely spot on. And for me, working in those libraries is what I've noticed the change, which I'm probably most proud of in a way, is the release of some of the snobbery that used to come with things like librarianship, and especially school libraries. And there was set text that kids read, and if you recommended books, it had to be a classic, or it had to be this. Boys come in, you recommend Hatchet, that sort of mindset that we got stuck in. And what I really like now is we're acknowledging that there are so many diverse learners out there. And I know, Sally, obviously it's such a personal journey for you, but when I was, and I talked to kids today actually about when I was at school, I struggled because I probably now, back then, would be labelled as potentially ADHD, neurodivergent, because I couldn't concentrate and focus. And now we're learning that those kids learn in different ways. So that's why libraries now are full of Bad Guys, Dog Man, these books that have the graphic side to it. They have language there. And 5-10 years ago, some libraries may have been considered that not, worthy content. And I work in a high school library, and we have Bad Guys, we have Dog Man, we have Captain Underpants, because we understand that's where the level is. And any reader in that high school in year 9, year 10 will take out a Bad Guys book or a Captain Underpants book because it's funny. And the kids that are at that lower level, who normally would feel ashamed not being able to read the higher content, they take out the same things all of their peers or their friends. So for me, it's that evolution of the content that we're putting out there now that covers everyone and gives everyone that license to feel encouraged as a reader. And as you said, at home, we don't know the literacy level of parents at different socio-economic levels. There are parents that may not be confident readers, but they can probably help their way through a kid's Bad Guys book. I think releasing that snobbery of what we're putting in their hands is such an important thing.
Yeah, I fully agree. And Sally, I have a question really that was directed at you because this is something that you spoke about at your launch event for the Laureate, some of these stereotypes and the kind of intellectual snobbery that comes attached with particularly stories that have a graphic element attached to them. And of course we know that, kids are actually way ahead of the game in their thinking and valuing of graphic forms of storytelling. But I always find it really interesting. I have a background of working in bookshops, and I've always found it really interesting that one of the most common things to happen is that people will come in. I don't want to point fingers, but, particular gatekeepers will come in with kids and they'll say such and such has been reading heaps of the Bad Guys and heaps of Dog Man and heaps of, exactly these books that we've just talked about. And they'll kind of say this as a bit of a whisper, like we're in on something together. I really want them to start reading real books now. And I wondered if you could both kind of get on your little soapbox for a second about why it is that these books are real books and why it's so important not only to support kids reading them, but in fact to give them agency over the choices that they're making in libraries and bookshops.
I think Alan and I are very aligned in this, as I know you and I are, Beck. And I still am shocked to come across people that don't see graphic novels as a valid form of sharing stories. I know when my son hit about grade 6, he became obsessed with manga. And manga is really sophisticated storytelling.
Yeah.
And in all throughout Asia and all throughout Europe, who has the bande dessinée, the animated graphic novels, they understand that you can have really complex storytelling broken down. It's almost like watching a short film, I think, when you look at a comic that's really well done. And he was engaging with these books in a very sophisticated way. He was able to talk about characters and storylines and motivations and all of these things. And I think it's really sad that we would see this as not an opportunity, but it happens all the time. I remember trying to stand up for my son in one of our very many parent-teacher meetings where they were complaining about his behaviour in the classroom, and me jumping in saying, well, guess what, he's just got really excited about manga, hoping that his teachers would see this as a type of progression. And his teacher literally said, oh, well, that's all very well, but he's not going to be able to study manga in year 12, is he? And I think even just having the idea that there's only one pathway, there's only one direction, and there's only one way of measuring intelligence I think is really letting our children down so much. And we set them up for failure with children who, it's great to hear you identify as having ADHD, Alan. I would say most of the best people I know identify as being ADHD. But school is not set up for kids like this, and it can be a really unfriendly, unwelcoming place.
Yeah.
And 12 years of a young person's lifetime to be put into that place where they don't feel like they fit, where they often feel worse. A 12-year-old child will have received 20,000 more admonishments than a non-ADH child by the time they get to age 12. That was one of the things I picked up in my research. And so to consider that we're forcing children to go through a system that doesn't work for them for the most formative years of their lives is such a disservice. And we really can do better. We have the imagination to do better. Individual teachers within the system do better. But the system itself is quite antiquated, and we really need to get better at not just identifying, recognising, but also supporting our neurodivergent kids so that they can all learn the way that suits them best. And graphic novels is such a fantastic way. Audiobooks, some children might require Braille. These are all valid ways of sharing stories.
Exactly, yeah. Yep, here. Alan, I wonder if you could jump onto this, and I also have a little quote from you, which is what I'm looking for, that you've spoken about making educated, brave choices in stocking the library shelves. And I feel like this ties into this because I do think that when we talk about manga, for example, there is this idea that all comics are the same and they're all kind of suitable for the same ages. This quote came from an article where you're exploring this very thing. And all comics are suitable for the same ages, and we don't necessarily, as adults, engage with curiosity and interest with graphic forms of storytelling in the same way that we would if they were reading novels. So I wondered, Alan, if you could perhaps expand on that quote in terms of this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And the graphic novel thing, obviously, it's huge. And there's a study, and I apologise, I can't remember who wrote it, but that it stated that graphic novels have 57 complex words per 1,000, whereas average chapter books have about 38. So the language that graphic novels are using are already much more complex because they've only got a small window, literally a bubble, to fit all of this information in. And the evolution of when I read Roy of the Rovers comic when I was a boy, there was only comics. We didn't have graphic novels. And the evolution of it now is it was always traditionally a boys' thing. The boys read the comics and the superheroes, books like that. Now you look at Raina Talmadge, I'll get the name wrong, with Guts, Smile, Sisters, Drama. Those books came out. The Babysitters Club came out in graphic novel form. Little Woman was a great one. There's this evolution of the graphic novel of what it once was. That there's something literally for everyone. And manga is the most popular collection in my high school library. And the thing about a graphic novel, the storytelling is so in-depth. And if you've got a parent or a grown-up or someone that has that inherited sort of snobbery, so, well, have you watched the Marvel movies? Can you imagine reading that and going into 1,000 more universes and finding out the real storylines? And it's that exploration of that I'll watch the movie, but the graphic novel's just for kids. So there's so many ways to work around that. But graphic novels are such an important teaching tool, and that the storylines are so complex. There's the relationships in them, there's empathy, there's so much within sort of that genre. And I'm stoked to see most school libraries and public libraries as well expanding those collections. So that's the thing, is we've got to sort of champion these new choices. And if you're stocking your library, you ask the kids what they want on the shelves. It's no good just going to the top 100 that the bookstore recommends or Googling top 100 children's books. You ask your customers, your clients, your students, whoever walks through that door must feel ownership of the space they are in. And if the collection doesn't reflect the reader, what's the point?
100%. I mean, it also seems to tie into what we actually expect the outcome of teaching somebody to read to be? And it's like, is it that we want to teach them to read a collection of words in a contract, for example? Or is it that we want to teach them empathy and curiosity and understanding people's stories and, you know, making meaning from the relationship of text and space, or text and image, or text and audio, for example? What's the most important thing to learn from reading for each of you?
Definitely empathy, I think, is the number one thing. I think there's no better way to understand what it's like, somebody else's experience is like, than through reading. And this can be storytelling. And so we've known throughout time that storytelling is how we pass on traditions, it's how we pass on culture. And reading is just one form of accessing storytelling. Books are one form of containing that storytelling. But there are so many ways that storytelling is how we connect and how we understand what it's like to be someone or something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Alan, what's the most important?
Yeah. I'd sort of alter one of the sort of famous sayings, and I tell kids that books are either a doorway or a mirror. Either you see yourself in it, or you can use it to go to another place. And depending on when I was younger, friends weren't my forte, so books were my friends for a long time. And I was always embarrassed saying that when I was younger, but now super proud of it because it taught me about the world. I had friends in the books that taught me about empathy, how to communicate, how to talk to people. Learned so much about the world, and I could read, and if I found books that I saw myself in, it gives you so much more worth and more connection. But if you need to escape, then that book becomes that doorway. When I read, Harry Potter in my late 20s, I wanted to be a boy at Hogwarts, I won't deny it. And I struggled having to wait for 8 years for the books to come out each year in my library. So for me, books give you that escape, or they give you that validation.
Well, that brings us quite nicely to talking about the places where we collect books, such as libraries, bookshops, classrooms. And I'm thinking about the ecosystem of a book and of a reader, which of course is made up of booksellers and parents and teachers and libraries and festivals and peers, older kids. What do you think? Which parts of that ecosystem do you see as currently really working, and which need extra support? And also, I guess, further to this question, I'm just thinking back to the anecdote that I shared earlier about the gatekeepers in graphic novels. And I do think sometimes that some of the parts of the ecosystem are almost placed in competition with each other. So to boil that down into a neater question, what can we better do to support the ecosystem of creating spaces that kids can make themselves or find themselves as readers in? Alan, I'll start with you. Perhaps you can talk about the role of the library.
I think libraries have started to evolve really, really well. I mean, libraries are the last free resource that people have most of the time. Here in New Zealand, most public libraries have free Wi-Fi, no fines. Everyone is welcome through the door. So having that open door makes it everyone's welcome. Everyone is equal within a library. So that access is really important. Schools, they're getting better. National Libraries have got the Teachers as Readers programs. We're trying to get readers to model reading for pleasure in schools. But not less than half of New Zealand schools will have a library or a librarian. So it's a tough battle. Where I think the biggest battle is in the home, because this generation now has more distractions than any other generation. And that's not their fault. We haven't modelled it going forward, and people blame screens and all of that sort of thing, but it's something that's been put there and put in place. So for me, it's the home and connecting with those communities. How do we create reading role models within the home? And if the kids have to be those reading role models, well, let's empower them to do so. And that's when, again, the libraries come in. So it's a trickle down and trickle up. And hopefully we meet the perfect spot in the middle somewhere.
Beautiful. Sally?
I loved your suggestion of encouraging kids to be subversive and getting their parents reading by bringing a really good book home.
Right.
I think that's such a great idea, because I often do talk a lot about adults role modelling, dads having their sons see them read, see that it's a masculine pursuit, not just something that women do. Often the school environment, and I do think this is changing, can be seen as quite female dominated, and so little boys can grow up thinking that learning school reading is something that girls do, and I think this is changing, and I think we're seeing this reflected in the books that we're publishing as well. But I think I would go back to libraries, because I think that the thing about libraries, particularly public libraries, is they give kids agency, that they're not, this is not reliant on your income, it's not reliant on what your friends are reading, it's not reliant on what your parents want you to read. You literally get to choose a handful of books off the shelves. 3 of them you might like, 2 you might not. It doesn't matter, because they're all free, you haven't put any money aside for it. And also, very much like what Alan was saying, they've become community hubs now. And so I do a lot of talks in public libraries, and there's one regular one I visit that just has, you know, someone sleeping in the corner every time I go in, and they just know it as their local person who, that's where he finds his shelter. And so I think more and more public libraries are really meeting the needs of what community is. They're very switched on, very connected to community. And I think we need to get clever about screens too. They're here to stay. All children have access to them. They're not all bad. I know certainly for my son, who struggles with books, screens were a really important way for him to be able to be a self-determined learner, and so he could learn at his own pace, and he could watch video clips and so forth. And interestingly, now he'll watch anime on television and read the subtitles. So he's reading for the purpose of the thing that he wants to do. So it's giving agency, and it's also looking at the way that we share stories. So a lot of the way that I learnt what it was like to be a neurodivergent person or someone living with a disability was going onto social media. And, you know, we can hear these people's stories now in a way that we weren't able to have access to before. So I think looking at clever ways that we can use social media to get kids into books, to share stories, and also for us to have access to stories that we may not have had access to before. I think it isn't the devil, you know, it is just a tool, and let's be really clever about how we use it.
It does seem also tied into letting kids choose what and how to read. What do you think we're so afraid of when it comes to letting kids choose what they read? Like, what are we worried about?
Shall I jump in?
Oh.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw that one out there.
All right. I
Please,
think it's the one thing that adults feel they can still control, because the screen is out of control, the internet is out of control. It doesn't matter how many filters you put onto it or how much screen time you allow your child. There's going to be, they're smarter than us, they're digital natives. They're going to be able to access domains that we don't even know exist out there. Whereas books, we can look at it and we can judge it very quickly. And I think it's a really poor situation where we think that this is an area that we should potentially not allow our children to have access to, because I work among some of the best writers in Australia. I'm so privileged to be a children's author, and we all take this very seriously. We know who our audience is. We know the stories that we feel comfortable sharing with them, and we know what it felt like to be a child. So the very last area where you are going to find people who are intentionally wanting to damage children or put bad things into their minds is among children's authors. And I do think it's like an easy target or low fruit. It's like, oh, okay, if we ban this book, or we don't let children have access to this kind of information through a book, they're going to find it anyway on the internet, I'm sorry. Whereas at least if they're finding it through a book that's well researched, and it is something where we really are thinking about who our readership is, they're more likely going to have their hand held throughout that learning process than if they're doing it on their own on the internet and you can't see what they're looking at.
Yeah, 100%. Anything to add to that, Alan?
No, I mean, yeah, that's exactly spot on. It's almost as if some adults want them to read more and read faster and get better, but then they want to limit them because, oh, that's not the right thing to read, or like, you know, years ago as well, you can't read that book, it's silly. But I mean, the book that I talk about, the kids that I want to get them into, if I'm going to get a real low-level person into, I'll say, have you read The Day My Bum Went Psycho by Andy Griffiths? And the parents go, oh, no, the kids are going, oh, yeah, sounds good. And that's it. We want them to be reading, we want them to get better, but we want to choose how fast or what it is they're taking in. And we can't do that, and that's why librarians are great, because we want to get them hooked onto our little stacks, and we're willing to say, you're up for this, and if you're not up for this, come back and get a different book.
Alan, you just mentioned that librarians are great, which obviously they absolutely are.
Biased.
Well, biased, not biased. Biased and fact can be both true.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, though, about both of you have mentioned that in Australia and New Zealand we're seeing fewer and fewer libraries in schools. And I just wonder, the people who are making the decisions to shut those libraries, I mean, thankfully we have a thriving public library ecosystem in both countries, but the people who are making those decisions to shut libraries in schools, what are they missing? What do they need to hear from you to understand the importance? Alan, I'll start with you.
Obviously, it's a tricky thing. We've just had a change of government recently, and it's always a changing sort of landscape. In schools, sometimes aren't resourced as well as they potentially could be. They need more room, their roles are soaring, and unfortunately, sometimes the library becomes a victim of that. I just basically encourage anyone that makes any sort of decision regarding children, literacy, libraries, books, come in and visit the school. Talk to a school librarian, talk to a public librarian if you have to. Talk to the people that are actually there who know the impact that these places are making. And as we said, libraries have become community spaces. And I believe that a good school library is the community hub of a school. It's where everyone is welcome, everyone is equal. And if they want students to connect and learn how to communicate, as we've said, books are those ways that you learn empathy, connection, and if you're just in the library to play Connect 4 or Monopoly or read in the corner, if you've got a place that is the community hub of the school, how invaluable is that? And I would just encourage anyone making those decisions to actually come onto the ground and visit a good, well-stocked, well-managed school library with a great school librarian.
Great advice. Anything to add, Sally?
I think that's so important. And I think if I think about what libraries were like when I grew up, and what they're like now, I think we really are updating libraries regularly. They are becoming, there's often quiet study areas, but there's often really loud interactive areas as well. And if you think about a school, particularly a high school, there's two places to hang out. You're either a sporty kid, so you're out on the field, or you're someone else. And a lot of these someone else's don't feel comfortable in that very physical, sporty environment. And that someone else place is a place of reading, but as in my son's high school, playing the piano or, playing a board game or doing the things that certainly when I was in high school were considered kind of bookish or nerdy. And I think we are really changing the dynamic of what it is like to be a creative, artistic, literary child and making this okay for boys as well. And I think that's what school libraries do, is that if you're sitting in a beanbag reading comics or you're banging away on the piano, that this is what a really good, thriving school library looks like. And it's a place that's welcome and invites all kinds of children in there, as Alan was saying.
Yeah, I'm definitely starting to see a common thread of some of the spaces where we need support coming from quite honestly outdated stereotypes about what it means to read, what's important about reading, and also what a library looks like. Because it seems to me that the reason you might potentially shut a library comes from this idea that they're places purely for physical books, and of course we don't need those because we have the internet now, which of course very tongue-in-cheek by the way, but also places of silence and a lack of community, when the reality of that is so different. So it seems like a lot of the policymakers, as you say, Alan, do need to actually get on the ground and see what it is that libraries and these kind of reading communities have to offer. I'd like to preface this next question with a little bit of research. And I can see that we've got some questions coming through on the Slido, so I will open up to them very shortly, so please keep sending them through. This research comes from Australia Reads and from a reading survey that they did, and some key stats that they found when it comes to reading for children, that 3-year-olds who can name a favourite book are better readers at age 7. Children who are exposed to more storybooks showed a greater inclination to read for pleasure and in turn had more advanced literacy skills as adults. As adolescents, my own literacy skills are failing me right now. Children who experience reading with a caregiver are more likely to read independently once their reading skills develop. 89% of children aged 6 to 17 agree their favourite books are the ones they've picked out themselves. 86% of children aged 6 to 17 said they loved being read books aloud at home or liked it a lot, the main reason being because it's a special time with parents. 1 in 5 parents of children aged 6 to 17, 20%, stopped reading aloud to their child before age 9, most often citing reasons related to their child being able to read independently. Of those of those children aged 6 to 8 whose parents no longer read books aloud at home, half of them did not want their parents to stop. And children who are given time for independent reading at school are more likely to enjoy reading books for fun. So this sort of supports a lot of what we've been saying, but also points to something else, which is this role model relationship between parents and their children. And just to, without wanting to get too data heavy, but to back it up with some other statistics, what we've seen in Australia is that recent surveys, also by Australia Reads, have shown now that only 1/3 of the adult population are reading frequently, and 25% aren't reading at all. That is, they haven't read a book in the last year. A 2021 New Zealand reading survey, although it had slightly more optimistic figures overall, also showed a decline in the number of adults reading across the year. And so, of course, when we're thinking about how significant it is to role model reading habits to our kids, and then we're seeing these decreasing numbers of adults themselves reading, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about it might be tips, techniques, supports that we can offer to adults to encourage them to start reading, not only directly to their kids, but just adjacent to their kids, with their kids. What has been successful for both of you in terms of creating adults who role model reading?
Do you want to start, Alan?
Yeah, I'll go quickly because I just had a wee bit of a guilt complex there because I did stop reading aloud at a certain age with my children because they were either reading themselves or we changed our routines and things like that, and it kind of fell by the wayside. But when I'm ever talking to any adult about that reading idea is that we don't have reasons not to read anymore, we have excuses. And that's not being harsh on people, but we do. It's washing to do, I've got jobs, I'm time poor. But 10 minutes of reading usually turns into 15, usually turns into 20. So you've just got to make it a habit, a routine. And if you are reading, make sure the children in your house are seeing you do it. If you're reading on a device, a tablet or a phone, make sure they know you're reading while you're on there, you're not just scrolling on the screen. We've got to be seen to be doing, it was what we're modelling to them. We've got to make it a habit. We've got to make it routine. We've got to make it normal for people to read for pleasure in their houses. Simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, 10 minutes is, it's barely anything.
Yeah.
I'll jump in with another stat that came up through the recent Grattan report in Australia. I imagine New Zealand's fairly similar in that 1/3 of our children in Australia are currently not reading at a proper proficient level to be able to be lifelong readers. So this research was also found 10 years ago. There was a report that was done, quite a thorough report, and published 10 years ago, showing exactly the same results. So we are actually seeing governments finally now start to listen. So our current education minister in Victoria, Ben Carroll, came along to a conference about how it is that we learn to read. He'd listened to a podcast by the American journalist Emily Stanford called Sold a Story, which talks a lot about the kind of teaching of reading we'd been doing, the part that had not been successful. And to his credit, he's now mandating new systems of teaching reading, which will hopefully, within a space of time, mean that most of our children will learn the skills they need to read. So that's the number one thing that we can do within our education system. But while I said, it's very important for parents to recognise it's not their role to teach reading, we can definitely support our children reading at home. So also all the stats, which I can't pull out of the top of my head, show that even reading to children from birth can be such a bonding experience. And we don't sing to our children like we used to, but in traditional cultures, we would sing lullabies. And a picture book really is the representation of the lullaby that we used to sing to our babies. And when I used to teach writing for children to adults, I'd often get them to bring their favourite book from childhood. And the visceral response that they'd have to this book, I remember this book not only how it made them feel having it read to them, but who read it to them. My grandmother used to read this to me, or my grade 6 teacher read this aloud at lunchtime. reading to your children is an incredible experience that will stay with them for life. I can vouch for this because I'm meeting adults who talk about this. And it is a really easy thing we can do. And for people who are time poor or who themselves find reading difficult, we have audiobooks. You can pop them on in the car. You can listen to an audiobook while you're cooking in the kitchen. And it's a really beautiful way to share stories. And if you really want to get on the same level as your child, an incredible conversation starter. So if you can see your child is struggling with something, maybe there's a friendship issue at school, or maybe they're just nervous about starting in high school, share a book that explores this with the child, and then you have an opportunity and an in to be able to talk with them about this. You know, how did the child in this book respond in that situation, and how does this make you feel? And it's such an easy way in that we can all access. Really, it's a direct portal to not only your child's experience of the world, but your own childhood as well. So there isn't a more beautiful way to share an experience with a child than reading with them.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I'll just add to that curiosity, you know, that it's so important to come to your kids and to their reading habits with curiosity. Like, I think, as you say, Sally, the conversation of, tell me, do you have issues with your friendship groups, which goes down like a lead balloon, as opposed to, oh, I was reading this book the other day and it was about this kid who's, you know, having X troubles. Totally different conversation ensues. On the note of feeling guilty about not reading out loud, Alan, I had also stopped reading out loud to my kid, who's now 11, and we saw a film yesterday that we wanted to know what happens next, so I went and got us the next book and have restarted, and can vouch that it's never too late. Might be a bit harder to get them to sit down with you, but there's still time. We've got some questions coming in, so I'm going to start throwing out to those. So if you are watching and have questions, then please feel free to start sending them through. I've got a question here that is sort of broadly speaking to the things we've been discussing, but about adults, which is, why do you think people lose their love of reading, and what can we as adults do to encourage other parents to read and centre reading, which I think is a great question. Any tips? Sally, we'll start with you.
I think what we're doing at the moment, and anybody that's tuned in, is on the right track. I think creating conversations around reading, creating a culture of reading within our communities as well. And this can be doing book launches, it can be doing activities at school. I know Book Week is a huge thing in Australia where kids dress up as book characters. Anything that brings books, characters, reading, storytelling into the home or into our culture, I think is just a really great way to start.
Yeah, great. Alan, encouraging other adults to read?
Yeah, absolutely. So they've got to be curious. If you're wondering what your children are reading, or you've heard about a particular book, and now, especially working in a high school library, some of the content that's coming through, you know, gets questioned. Sort of new genres like new adult, which, you know, it's very fluid in between age groups and things like that. And if you've heard about a book that you're unsure of, get it out and read it. There's no better way to understanding what your kids are experiencing or reading by reading it yourself. And it may give you that, you know, peek through the window into what's in their heads. If they're not communicating in normal ways, potentially what they're reading is actually a signal for you to be able to tap into. So I'd say be curious and make time. If you can, make time. Everyone can make 10 minutes. And if you're reading a good book, you will never stop at 10 minutes.
Yeah. Also, just like normalise taking books to the pub, you know, when you're meeting adults, let them see you reading, ask them what they're reading, and then if they don't have an answer, maybe they'll feel panicked to start reading something for next time. Yeah, that's right. Shame people, that's right. No, that's not at all what I'm suggesting. There's some great questions coming through, so I'm just going to try and get as many as we can in. What are some good questions to ask young people about the books they're reading? I love that. Alan, Sally, anything?
So is that, what are some good questions to ask kids about what they're reading?
Yeah, so in terms of showing that curiosity, what kind of questions? I know for me, actually, it's just about a genuine curiosity of, oh, that sounds cool, tell me what happens in the story, but from a place of... Are you enjoying
yes,
it? Yeah.
Are you enjoying that book? And if you're like, that's okay, it's like, oh, are you still reading it to find out what happens? Yeah, oh, okay, so you are enjoying it enough. And if they go, no, I'm really not enjoying it, well, do you want me to take you to the library to get a new one or swap it over tomorrow? Make it okay. Never use the word fail. But if you're not enjoying the book, there's thousands of others in your library. But if you want to see what happens, keep reading it. It's all good. But you've got to ask them, are they enjoying it? And if so, oh, cool, what's it about? So opening up those conversations, yeah.
Great
That's
question.
a great one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also, particularly with younger children, what would you do in that situation? So that's interesting what that person did. What would you do? And I think it really opens up that idea of reading to get an idea of how it is to be somebody else in the world, and would you have acted in that way, and do you think that what she did was kind? Or I think there's some really simple language that we can use around what stories are telling us, and how you could translate that to your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question that is, what would the first step be if your child just isn't interested in reading? Sally, we'll start with you.
I'd start with audiobooks. I just surreptitiously get in there, put one on in the car, or I think audiobooks are incredible. They're beautifully read by professional actors. Some of them are hilarious. You can get short story ones. You can download them for free from your local public library. And just pop audiobooks in the car, and then potentially happen to have the same books lying around the lounge room, and pick one up and, oh, look, there's a bit more of this story that we were listening to in the car. There are a lot of surreptitious ways in that can make, I guess, sharing stories fun and engaging rather than a chore or homework. I think the worst possible thing we can do is to send a child to their room to do their reader. I think that's a sure way to kill a love of reading.
Especially when the readers are often except School of Monsters, obviously. My kid brought home a reader once that was about floppy disks, and he was like, what are these? I said, you don't need to know. We don't use those anymore.
Wow.
Alan, tips for starting with reluctant readers?
Do your research. Find out what they like. If depending how young they are, whether they're into sports, whether they like ponies or rugby or hamsters or unicorns, and go and find that book. Ask a librarian. Don't just say, what's a good book for a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old? Say, my 4-year-old seems to really like dragons. Try and make that effort to be specific. If we've got any problem with our children as they grow up, we look for solutions. And we ask other people if we don't know. And so, same as with books, if they're struggling on that journey and you're a little bit lost, ask someone, ask another parent. Parents, we love giving each other advice and things, and I love suggesting books to my friends. Like I bought all manner of picture books today because picture books are just glorious. So do your research. It's not that onerous. Don't go online. Actually ask real people. Ask librarians. Ask other parents. And that's how you'll find out. And then ask your child what it is they might be interested in.
Yeah. Even better, take them to the bookshop and just go, I will buy you whatever book you want. Like, the freedom there is amazing, and guaranteed they'll find something. Also, I feel like so many things are getting turned into films, podcasts. There's so many ways to sneak them into a story and ignite their curiosity before then saying, did you know we could actually read more about these characters in the books? So, sneak it in. On that note, we have a question asking, what books would you recommend for the whole family to read together with really positive messages?
Oh, I'm unprepared for that one. Have you got one off the top of your head, Alan?
Well, have you heard of Sally Rippin? He's got some quite good titles out there. But actually, in all seriousness, I think some of Sally's are great to read aloud, and I think it's a great place to start. But as I said, I'm a huge fan of picture books, and the evolution of picture books over the last 5, 10, 15 years is they've become so important. The art, the illustrations, but the meanings and sophisticated picture books. And you were talking before about finding a need, finding a book that might fit a particular need, and I like the idea of prescription pad literature as finding a book that might suit a need a child has. Like, for example, I've got this book here, My Elephant is Blue, which is a picture book by Nelsos Mena, and it's about anxiety, potential depression, and about simple ways you can sort of work through those things, and they're beautiful. So I think picture books are an exceptional place to start. I really do.
They're like short films, really. People really underestimate the work that goes into a picture book. And
Absolutely.
I would jump back to what you say, Alan, too, in that ask the child, what are they interested in, and let them choose. And I think we often forget that if we spend less time talking at our children and more time listening, we can actually learn a lot. That was a really hard journey for me to discover with my son. And because he wasn't a reader, I would find opportunities to let him choose the music in the car. And it was often music that would not be what I'd choose by choice. But there were conversations that could be had there, and he just liked it that I was interested in his view of the world. And so I think the more you, and I think curious is a word that's come up a lot here, the more you remain open and curious and present with your child, let them lead the conversation, let them choose the book, let them choose the way that they want to share the stories with you, the more likely they'll be to step into that space as well, rather than always deciding what we think is best.
Right, and I feel like it opens them up more to listening when we say, hey, you should read this book, because you've listened to them when they said, hey, you should read this book.
Yep.
So it becomes that kind
It's
of
only fair.
give a little, that's right, it's my turn.
Yep.
How can people advocate for a library in their school? Any tips for getting one in? Actually, I'm going to jump in and answer this one first, which is that another excellent children's and YA writer from Australia, Kirsty Murray, I know that she was part of a very dedicated group of parents and grandparents who got a library re-established in their school by basically starting up like a renegade one. And it was staffed by parents and grandparents and friends, and then developed, and based on the demand, they were able to argue for the need in the school. So that was a really excellent and effective way.
I did hear about that story and happened to donate some books to that very worthy cause, which is really good. So I definitely think just keep pushing for it. Really let the school know how important it is to you. And also there's a very famous children's author that tells a story about one of the schools he visited up in northern Queensland somewhere, where the library was the only air-conditioned place in the school. So there are ways that you can find ways to make a library enticing and interesting. And there was just off camera before, Alan, you were chatting about a really fantastic reading scheme as well, which we just think is totally brilliant and should definitely be happening here in Australia.
That's right. Alan, do you want to tell us about Books and Pizza?
So with the New Zealand Children's and Young Persons Book Awards you talked about, they've been sponsored a long time by Hell Pizza, a pizza company here, and the Hell's Pizza Reading Challenge is schools get delivered a stack of these discs, and they have 7 circles, and every time a child comes and reviews a book or reads a book, the librarian will stamp it and initial it, and after 7 books have been read and stamped, they can take it into Hell Pizza and get a free small children's pizza. So obviously some people are like, pizza, we're not sure, but over the course of that reading program, tens of thousands of them, were cashed in, and hopefully that reflects in that many books being read. And that's the thing, and we're really lucky in New Zealand as well with national libraries, is that if you're advocating for a library in your school, there's national library facilitators that work in that area with all the school librarians. After we've had recent natural disasters here, floods and things, national libraries contacted schools that lost their library and helped them rebuild or restock them. So for me, it's you talk to national libraries. We have board of trustees for each school here. They're kind of like a board that runs the school. You talk to them, you advocate. You basically have to get involved. And then things like that, if you happen to know the Hell Pizza Reading Challenge is on with the Children's Book Awards, you read those books and then you say, well, we've read these 7 books by these authors, let's stamp our card. And it's just that way, different ways of getting involved. But you've got to get involved. You've got to make an impact. You've got to actually be present.
Yeah,
So good.
so good. Pressure the policymakers.
And the pizza makers.
And the pizza makers. So if there are any pizza makers watching this who would like to get on board, then reach out via the Wheeler Centre. Yeah, that's right. Like we're not fussy. Pizza, donuts, chocolates, we'll take what we can get. Look, we have come to the end of questions and also to the end of time. So thank you to everyone who has tuned in to watch the live stream. Thanks to everyone who watches this as a recording later. And of course, biggest thanks to Sally and Alan and all of the readers and those advocating for young readers out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Ka kite anō.